everyone. Thank you for still being with us. My name is Molly, and as mentioned, my background is in special education. I've been a classroom teacher for 9 years, and I've been lucky enough to experience teaching both in a really large public school setting in San Francisco, as well as now a small independent school in Northern Virginia. So what I'm here to talk about today is the fact that ADHD is often really a puzzling thing for educators. At the same time, there's an impression that it's overdiagnosed, and these days every kid is being handed an ADHD diagnosis. But at the same time, you probably hear stories about people being diagnosed later in life or finding out and noticing these sort of ADHD tendencies in themselves. And how can that be? What can we do to make sure that all of the students are being supported and nobody's sort of falling through the cracks when we see this sort of stereotypical media image of a little boy who can't sit still? And obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. So Commonwealth Academy is where I currently work, and we got to hear from the amazing Mary earlier, so she set this up for me perfectly. And one of the things that I noticed, first it being such a small school compared to the 1,400 kids I was used to previously, our school has fewer than 200 students, and kind of even more startling, the male to female ratio for students is 70 to 30. So we have a lot of boys and just a few girls. I was kind of starting because that was just a sort of shocking environment to come into. But I started to think, are the rates of prevalence for learning differences like ADHD and dyslexia actually that disproportionate, or is this sort of a weird coincidence? And it soon became very clear that it does in fact mimic trends that have been observed around the world in terms of who's being diagnosed with ADHD. But in my research, I came to find the picture is a lot more complicated than just who's being diagnosed. You can see here just sort of a figure from NIH about the percentage of students diagnosed with ADHD during their childhood and adolescence. For boys, it hovers around 12. For girls, around maybe 4 to 5%. But in order to understand this number, we need to take a deeper look here. There are two subtypes. So the first being the one that we maybe see the most, which would be the predominantly hyperactive. So this is the student who kind of acts like they have a motor going, who has a really hard time sort of attending to the lecture. And we sort of kind of have this stereotype with us when we think of ADHD. However, there's also the predominantly inattentive type that can look like something completely different. So this can show up in behaviors like difficulty following through, even losing things, or even trying to speak up in class, but becoming lost and not really being able to articulate the thought. Both of these things have to do with executive functioning, which I think Mary explained extremely well. So it really crosses the gamut out of just behavioral concerns into prioritizing what they should do first. How should they spend their free time? When is the best time to take a break? Does anything about your school day is impacted? So what is clear is that although boys are diagnosed more frequently than girls with ADHD, they also tend to be diagnosed with the hyperactive subtype more frequently. The inattentive and combined is more common overall, but if you look at the gender breakdown, far more boys are being diagnosed with hyperactivity. This kind of behavior requires a lot more teacher attention. So a student who's having a hard time with sort of movement and things like that disrupt others often need immediate intervention. So it led me sort of to my question. Since you have a school where there are more boys with hyperactivity, are female students doing as well as maybe sometimes we think they are? So girls exhibiting an inattentive type of ADHD may be experiencing their school day completely differently than what it looks like from the outside. So I wanted to see if this translates into less attention being given to these students and less support. And then I want to go from there to sort of discover what are the best practices in this situation. Obviously, this is a really big undertaking. And so what I'm going to present to you today is sort of the beginning of this journey. And hopefully next year, I'll be able to show you kind of the conclusion, but just the background for today. So my hypothesis is that because female students tend to have more invisible symptoms, they may be viewed as teachers as compliant and maybe feeling more successful than they themselves feel. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I discovered in terms of what has created this issue where there could be potential for girls kind of falling through the cracks in this situation. So first of all, the symptoms don't present themselves the same across boys and girls. So for girls with hyperactive behavior, it may be things like interrupting, things like personal space, or even just a perception of being dramatic or controlling. For the inattentive type, this is kind of a shy, disorganized, doesn't like to challenge others, feels anxious. And if you'll notice in both of these situations, this can be masked by lots of other explanations really easily. So all of these things have lots of other potential causes, and it's also really easy to write off as like a willful choice for some of these things. Other things that I learned were huge barriers that explain the discrepancy are that before 1980, there was no category for inattention on the DSM manual. That has changed. As well as the fact that some screening tools emphasize the hyperactive set of symptoms. There are more questions that sort of lead to that than there are about inattention. And the last thing that was really surprising was that previously, in order to qualify for a diagnosis of ADHD, some of your symptoms had to have started before age 7. However, with girls, there are also lots of research to support that hormones ruin a lot of things about your life at that age as a girl. And one of them is that it can cause your ADHD symptoms to get much worse. And so in order to qualify for a diagnosis, previously, you wouldn't have met that age 7 cutoff. So the other issue here is that, as I mentioned, it can be masked by a lot of things. It's likely that girls who are having trouble with school, so grades are often sort of our little warning shot, they may be referred for learning disabilities instead of ADHD because of low performance. They also may just end up getting in a lot of trouble and getting 10 million detentions instead of anybody thinking, why is this student getting 10 million detentions? And I'd like to now give kind of a case study of a student who does not have an ADHD diagnosis, but has, in my opinion, a really strong case for maybe that being what's going on. And she's going to talk a little bit about her struggle to just try to get this diagnosis. And she's 16, so it's been a long journey. She's had some support since she's in 5th grade. So
when I originally got tested, which was in 5th grade, I had a big, the big issue was my OCD, because I had very extreme OCD. And they said that I had ADD symptoms, but to focus on the OCD because that was more prominent and needed to be taken care of. However, it just kind of got dropped after that. And so I felt the symptoms, and I've been saying it for years that I thought I had ADD, but it got broken down to like just me having anxiety because I have OCD and anxiety, which they said the symptoms were just symptoms of those rather than ADD, and so my OCD and anxiety kind of covered it up. But recently I was describing it to my psychologist, I believe it is, and they're like, oh, you know what, we think you have ADD, and I was like, finally somebody said it.
So she presents a pretty classic case because another fact that I learned is that girls tend to have other comorbidities along with their ADHD. So it can be anxiety and depression and OCD, like our case study mentioned, but it also can be things like problems with dyslexia, sleep issues, autism spectrum disorder. All of these things tend to sort of come in a cluster. So it makes it really hard for doctors or teachers to kind of determine what the biggest cause is. For the classroom, this has a big implication. Teachers themselves in a study in 2004 mentioned that they thought that ADHD is more prevalent in boys, that they had a hard time recognizing it in girls, but at the same time, they said that girls identified with ADHD seem to be having more kind of emotional problems dealing with the issue. So I think that as a teacher, as I mentioned before, we have this tendency sometimes to attribute kind of intent where there may not be any. And it's really important to understand more about kind of the ADHD brain and to learn some of the strategies that Mary mentioned about kind of the coaching and the dialogue model. Because what I have learned is that ADHD brains need stimulation, they will seek it, and then they will retreat from whatever has happened. And that can take a lot of forms. So what I wanted to do is kind of start to quantify this. So I found a wonderful book that is one of the only books I could find specifically about girls with ADHD. And I developed a survey that will be sent to female high school students next year, hopefully also middle school, just asking them to measure how impacted are you by your symptoms on a daily basis here at a school that is set up for kids with executive functioning and ADHD issues. There will also be a component for teachers. I want to survey teachers to see what they are noticing in their own classrooms. When I analyze that data, I'll be looking for a discrepancy on if we are overlooking, are we overestimating, underestimating sort of the impact in this population that is rare. I'm also going to have my ed tech consultant come in and actually measure my time per student, and then we'll control for kind of how many girls or boys I have in the room, but just see how much time am I spending? Am I spending all my time dealing with hyperactivity? Am I spending time checking in with the kid who could be working or could be just thinking about anime, for all I know? So I'm going to kind of see what it actually looks like in my classroom. So obviously there are limitations. So socialization can definitely impact how people present their symptoms. So girls being sort of taught to not kind of speak and act out can definitely impact it potentially. My sample group is of course a group of students who have been aware of their issues for a long time and have the means to try to address it with the specialized schooling. And of course, there, as I mentioned, is limited available research now, and it doesn't account for people who may not identify within the gender binary. So I hope to be here next year, sort of talking about the next steps and what I found. And I think I'm out of time, but I had a wonderful clip where one of my students advised us all to just chill out, but then she gave us a really long list of things to do that include researching and trying to understand our students on this level, because if we are informed, then that gives us all the tools we need to empower our students. Thank you so much.